You got President Bush reading about a pet goat in a grade school, and his staff there already know about the hijackings. Now somebody's about to put the president on the spot to take command. Now, God knows if George W. Bush had actually taken command on 9/11, we might all be nuclear toast today for his ability to handle things. But my vision came to me as I pieced this together that Dick Cheney got up out of his chair in the White House and ran to the PEOC so that he could assume hands-on control before anybody else could get there. So they stalled Bush. There was actually a couple of Secret Service agents. Ari Fleischer held up a sign that said, "Don't leave yet." Other Secret Service agents held the president in the school. That's why, because sitting on that stage, he could not take command of anything. He was reading to children. The cameras were on him. He had a perfect excuse, the perfect alibi for not being in command, and that's exactly where Dick Cheney wanted him. Dick Cheney was the acting commander-in-chief, and the Secret Service was the supreme command. Here's the motive for the crime: peak oil. In about 100 years, mankind has used roughly half of all the oil that nature placed on this planet. That simple. We'll talk more about that in detail. We have clearly established in crossing the Rubicon with documentary records, not only from the Vice President's Energy Task Force, but from a number of other sources, they're all laid out in the book, that there was clear knowledge that this crisis was coming a long time before 9/11. I know that Dick Cheney knew. That's also established in the book, and of course he came from Halliburton. Once the midpoint is crossed, and all oil production always follows a peak, a bell curve, and once you hit the peak, you come down, and as you're coming down the peak, no matter how much money you throw at the problem, no matter how many more wells you drill, you will never be able to produce more oil than you were at the peak. And we are now probably at peak plus or minus 1 year, maybe 2 years at the most. I'm going to close with that because that's kind of the scariest part. Almost everything in modern society is reliant upon oil. All plastic is made of oil. There are 10 calories of hydrocarbon energy in every calorie of food that you eat. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. When a farmer plants a field, he drives a hydrocarbon-powered vehicle to till the soil. Then he comes back along with a hydrocarbon-powered vehicle to plant the seed. Then he has to pump water, irrigation, and how does the electricity get generated? Natural gas, or oil, or coal. Then he comes along and sprays it with fertilizers. All commercial fertilizers are made from natural gas, the source of ammonia. Then he sprays it with pesticides. All commercial pesticides are made from oil. Then he comes along in a hydrocarbon-powered vehicle again and harvests it, puts it in another hydrocarbon-powered vehicle, drives it to a food processing plant that runs on electricity and throws more chemicals in it, wraps it in plastic, which is oil, throws it into another hydrocarbon-powered vehicle, which drives it to your supermarket, where you walk in, pull out a piece of plastic, also oil, and pay for it. Hydrocarbon energy is diminishing. We eat oil and natural gas. 4 days after becoming vice president, 4 days, Dick Cheney convened his National Energy Policy Development Group, NEPDG, which I believe contains the deepest, darkest secrets of 9/11. And he's refused to release the documents. It became a Supreme Court case. And the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, how many people believe that we have a Supreme Court? We have a Republican court, of course, upheld a grossly unconstitutional action because that group was funded by taxpayer dollars that involved private corporations having access to, in secret, to a government-sponsored entity. That's blatantly unconstitutional. Suits were filed. A couple of documents came out. We'll talk about that in a minute. Dick Cheney knew about peak oil as early as 1999. And 9/11 made possible what Dick Cheney called the war that will not end in our lifetimes. I'll never forget watching him say that on television. We are chasing the last remaining hydrocarbon energy reserves around the planet. And this is something I said it from the wilderness 3+ years ago. And it was a map that we laid out 3+ years ago, and the world is following the map. Now, whether you believe or not that the world is running out of oil, if you are reasonably sane and off your medication, you will have to believe that the world is acting as if peak oil were real. Yes? Yes. Opportunity, means, motive, and opportunity. The war games. We broke these down, and I have to pay homage to researcher Barbara Honegger, who kept asking me to look at the war games. She didn't quite get how they all work together, but she kept hammering me, and she gave me some great information, and finally I sat down and locked myself in a room for about 2.5, 3 days with the raw data on the war games, and I saw the picture. And I saw what happened on 9/11. In May of 2001, Dick Cheney was placed directly in charge of managing the seamless integration of all training exercises throughout the federal government and military agencies by a presidential directive from the White House. The morning of 9/11 began with a series of what we put in the book of four confirmed hijack drills involving NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and the FAA. And one was Vigilant Guardian, which was a hijack drill. We confirmed through press stories that that drill involved the insertion of false radar blips on radar screens in the Northeast Air Defense Sector. Then another one was Northern Vigilance, scheduled sometime before 9/11, which had moved large numbers of fighter aircraft out of the Northeast Air Defense Sector to Canada and Alaska, anticipating an over-the-pole Soviet attack. Now, for those of us who were my age, I'm 53, we remember the duck and cover drills in high school when the Russians were going to come over the pole and attack. Those are drills from the 60s, the 70s. That drill was scheduled simultaneously with Vigilant Guardian. We also discovered Northern Vigilance, which I have confirmed since the book was published. Somebody read the book and dug up some non-classified documents confirming that more fighters had been moved to Iceland on 9/11, and so they were unavailable to respond. And the bottom line is that when the hijackings, in quotes, occurred on September the 11th, the FAA controllers were looking at their radar screens, and we have on-the-record statements from Jane Garvey of the FAA, among others, that we got 11 possible hijackings, and I confirmed at the time that there were no more than 8 fighters. Now, fighters always fly together. So you've got 11 possible, but one other statement said 22 possible hijackings. That was accounting for some of the false radar injects. Then Richard Clarke comes out with his book, Against All Enemies, this last year. And boy, he left more clues in that book than any detective would ever want to be happy with. But he quoted then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the acting chairman, General Richard Myers, who was now the chairman, as saying, we're in the middle of another exercise called Vigilant Warrior. And I was able to obtain, because of all the 9/11 books that are out there, and there are some good ones out there, I express a lot of confidence in David Ray Griffin's work, and also especially in Paul Thompson's wonderful 9/11 timeline. Paul Thompson has done some amazing work, and those are 2 books that belong in your 9/11 library for sure. But we dug and we looked, but I'm the only guy that has gone out and actually knocked on doors. I mean, I was a detective. And I've done original investigative research. And part of me wanted to do my 9/11 research like Andy Sipowicz from NYPD Blue, where I could throw people around a little bit, and kind of rough them up. But you can't do that with generals and, appointed. So I played Columbo. You got... Now, wait a minute. You got 4 or 5 different exercises going and 22 possible hijacks. What idiot scheduled all of these things to happen all on September the 11th? And nobody would tell me. I got as high as a deputy secretary of defense for public affairs. And nobody would tell me. And then I found the paper trail, and it was Dick Cheney, who was running them all on 9/11. So, but the problem is Dick Cheney is not in jail. And if I keep this up, I may soon be.